In a house where all the clocks stopped at the same time, a man vanished. What if his disappearance was more than just a coincidence? The silence hit Detective Michael Hale like a physical force as he stepped through the threshold of 419, Blackwood Drive. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of an empty house, this was different, dense and oppressive, like walking through invisible syrup. The autumn sun streaming through the windows did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The Victorian-style home belonged to Professor James Riggs, a respected historian at the local university who had vanished 2 days ago, leaving his door locked from the inside. The case might have gone unnoticed longer if not for Eleanor Livingston, the elderly neighbor whose keen eyes had registered the unusual darkness in the professor's windows and his conspicuous absence from his daily routines. Michael moved through the entrance hall, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Everything looked perfectly ordinary at first glance, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows. But something felt off, a discordance he couldn't quite place until his eyes fell on the grandfather clock standing sentinel in the corner. Its pendulum hung motionless, its hands frozen at 3:17. That's when he noticed the second clock, a delicate silver timepiece perched on a nearby shelf, its hands similarly frozen. And another on the wall, 3:17. The detective's pulse quickened as he moved from room to room, discovering the same impossible scenario repeated throughout the house. Every single clock, whether antique or modern, mechanical or digital, displayed the exact same time. Drawing his phone from his pocket, Michael checked the time, only to feel his stomach drop. The screen showed 3:17, though the seconds continued their relentless march forward. He tapped the screen, navigated to settings, but everything seemed to be functioning normally except for those frozen digits. "This is Detective Hale," he spoke into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to need technical support at the Riggs residence. Something's interfering with electronic devices here." Only static answered him. The kitchen told its own strange story. A coffee cup sat on the counter, a thin film of dried liquid at the bottom suggesting it had been abandoned mid-sip. The morning newspaper lay spread open on the kitchen table, its pages ruffled as if someone had been reading it recently. A half-eaten piece of toast had gone stale beside it, jam congealing on its surface. Michael's trained eye caught other details that seemed subtly wrong: a chair pulled out at an awkward angle, a cabinet door left slightly ajar, a set of keys dropped haphazardly by the sink instead of hanging on their usual hook by the door. It was as if Professor Riggs had been interrupted in the middle of his morning routine, but by what? The detective made his way upstairs, where the air felt even heavier. The professor's study door stood partially open, spilling a wedge of light into the dim hallway. Inside, the room looked like an academic tornado had torn through it. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages splayed open like broken wings. Papers covered every surface, some covered in the professor's neat handwriting, others bearing mysterious symbols and diagrams Michael didn't recognize. Among the chaos, a leather-bound notebook caught his attention. It lay open on the desk, its last entry written in a hand that seemed more hurried than the professor's usual precise script: "They're watching. Today at 3:17. A chill crawled up Michael's spine as he read those words. Who were they? And why that specific time? He lifted his gaze from the notebook, catching a glimpse of movement in the window's reflection, a dark shape that seemed to shift behind him. He spun around, hand instinctively moving to his weapon, but the study was empty. The floorboards creaked softly, as if someone had just stepped away, but he was alone in the room. Or at least, he appeared to be. Back at the precinct, Michael sat at his desk, staring at the crime scene photos spread before him. Each one seemed to mock his understanding of reality, every clock in frame showing that impossible time. He'd had the technical department check his phone, but they found nothing wrong with it. The moment he'd left the house, it had started displaying the correct time again. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Hale," Detective Sarah Martinez said, dropping into the chair across from him. She was his partner of 3 years, known for her sharp mind and even sharper intuition. What's got you spooked? Michael ran a hand through his graying hair. Something's not right about this case, Sarah. The professor's neighbor said he was a creature of habit, same routine every day for the past decade. Then suddenly, he vanishes without a trace, door locked from the inside, and every clock in his house. He trailed off, knowing how crazy it would sound. Every clock what? Sarah leaned forward, her dark eyes intent. Before he could answer, Officer Jenkins approached with a file. Detective Hale. We pulled the professor's phone records like you asked. He handed over a thick stack of papers. Guy made a lot of calls in the days before he disappeared. Michael thanked him and began scanning the list. Most were to colleagues at the university or local antique dealers, fitting for a history professor with a passion for old timepieces. But one number appeared repeatedly in the final days, Laura King. It took some digging, but they found her easily enough. Laura was a graduate student in the university's history department, specializing in ancient artifacts and their cultural significance. When they brought her in for questioning, Michael was struck by how young she looked, early 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down her nose. Professor Riggs was my thesis advisor, she explained, fidgeting with a pendant around her neck. He was helping me research temporal artifacts, objects that different cultures believed could manipulate time. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Temporal artifacts? Yes, like the chronolith of Alexandria or the Maya time stones. Laura's eyes lit up with academic enthusiasm. Most people dismiss them as myths, but Professor Riggs believed some of these legends might have been based on real objects. He was particularly interested in something called the Tempest Mirror. Michael felt that same chill he'd experienced in the professor's house. Did he find something? Laura's expression shifted, enthusiasm giving way to worry. About a week ago, he called me late at night, completely excited. Said he'd made a breakthrough. He'd found references to a mirror that supposedly existed right here in the city, brought over by European settlers in the 1800s. He was convinced it was real. And then? Sarah prompted. Then things got strange. Laura's voice dropped. He started calling at odd hours, saying he felt like he was being watched. 3 days ago, he called in a panic. Said they had found him. That he'd been right about everything, but he'd been wrong to look for it. He told me to stay away from his research, that it wasn't safe. She hugged herself, as if warding off a chill. That was the last time I heard from him. Michael exchanged a glance with Sarah. Did he mention anything about 317? Laura's face went pale. How did you know about that? He was obsessed with that time in his last few calls. Said it kept appearing everywhere, in his research, in his dreams. He thought it was significant somehow, but he wouldn't tell me why. After Laura left, Sarah turned to Michael. You thinking what I'm thinking? That we need to search his house again? Yeah. He grabbed his coat. But this time, we're going at night. The sun was setting as they pulled up to 419, Blackwood Drive, painting the Victorian's windows in shades of blood and gold. Michael felt the weight of his flashlight and service weapon, wondering if either would be of any use against whatever had taken the professor, if indeed something had taken him at all. I pulled some records on the house while you were finishing up paperwork, Sarah said, killing the engine. It was built in 1873 by a merchant named Theodore Blackwood, that's where the street name comes from. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances 3 years after moving in. Michael turned to her sharply. Disappeared how? According to the newspaper archives, he simply vanished one night. The interesting part? All the clocks in the house reportedly stopped at the same time. She met his gaze. Want to guess what time? 3:17, Michael said quietly. Sarah nodded. The case was never solved. The house changed hands multiple times over the years. I found 3 more cases of disappearances, spread out over decades. None of the bodies were ever found. Why wasn't this flagged when Riggs bought the place? The disappearances were classified differently, one as a probable suicide, one as a possible runaway, another as an unexplained missing persons case. Nobody connected the dots. She pulled out her tablet. But look at this, I had the archive department dig deeper. Each disappearance happened exactly 50 years apart. Michael felt his pulse quicken. When was the last one? 1973, Professor James Whittaker, also a historian. He was researching local folklore when he vanished. Sarah's voice was grim. Michael, it's 2023. 50 years. He checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. We've got time before 3:17. Let's see what we can find. They approached the house, its Victorian architecture looming against the darkening sky. Michael inserted the key they'd gotten from the department locksmith, half expecting it not to work, but the door opened smoothly. The silence inside was even more oppressive than before, as if the house was holding its breath. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, catching dust motes that seemed to dance with purpose in the air. The grandfather clock in the hallway remained frozen at 3:17, its stillness somehow more menacing in the dark. We should split up, Sarah suggested. I'll take the ground floor, you check upstairs. Michael wanted to object, every horror movie he'd ever seen screamed against the idea, but she was right. They had limited time, and there was a lot of ground to cover. Radio check every 5 minutes, he insisted. Any sign of trouble, you call immediately. Upstairs, the professor's study looked different in the beam of his flashlight, shadows twisting the piles of books and papers into strange shapes. Michael began a methodical search, paying special attention to the materials scattered across the desk. Most were printouts of old newspaper articles and historical records, many featuring the same words circled in red: mirror, time, and 3:17. A leather-bound journal caught his attention, not the same one he'd seen earlier, but older, its pages yellow with age. Inside, the handwriting was different from Riggs', more elaborate and antiquated. The first page bore an inscription, "Property of Theodore Blackwood, 1873." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Most entries were mundane business records, but toward the end, they became increasingly erratic. The final entry made his blood run cold. I have found it at last, the Tempest Mirror. The legends were true. It shows not our reflection, but time itself. Yet something is wrong. The reflection moves when I do not. I see shapes behind my shoulder that cannot be there. They are watching. Always watching. The mirror shows 3:17, though my pocket watch claims midnight approaches. I must. The entry ended mid-sentence. Mike. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio, making him jump. You need to see this. In the basement. There isn't a basement, he replied. It wasn't in the house plans. Well, I'm standing in front of a door that says otherwise. Michael descended the stairs quickly, Blackwood's journal still clutched in his hand. He found Sarah in the kitchen, her flashlight beam focused on what appeared to be an ordinary pantry door. Except the pantry he'd seen earlier had been on the opposite wall. That door wasn't there this morning, he said. I know. Sarah's voice was tight. I've been through this kitchen twice. This door just appeared while I was checking the living room. I heard a sound like old wood settling, came back, and here it was. Michael approached slowly, studying the door. It looked ancient, its dark wood worn smooth with age. An intricate pattern was carved around its frame, symbols that looked similar to the ones he'd seen in Riggs' papers upstairs. Those markings, Sarah said, leaning closer. They look like some kind of timepiece design. See how they flow in a circle. Michael pulled out his phone to document the door, but the camera app wouldn't open. In fact, his phone showed only one thing, 3:17. He checked his watch, 8:23 p.m. The disconnect made his head spin. We should wait for backup, Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew that by the time backup arrived, the door might vanish again. If we wait, we might lose our only chance to find out what happened to Riggs. Michael reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through more than just the kitchen. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the beam of their flashlights swallowed by the gloom below. The air that drifted up was stale and carried a metallic tang, like old pennies. "Ladies first," Sarah quipped, but she was already starting down the stairs, her weapon drawn. Michael followed close behind, trying to ignore the sensation that the darkness was pressing against his back. The stairs seemed to go down much further than should have been possible in a house this size. The temperature dropped with each step, until their breath fogged in the beams of their flashlights. The walls were lined with the same strange symbols they'd seen around the door, glowing faintly with a phosphorescent light. Finally, they reached the bottom. The basement was a single large room with rough stone walls that looked far older than the house above. Their flashlight beams revealed scattered furniture draped in sheets, old trunks, and bookshelves lined with volumes that looked ancient. But it was the object at the center of the room that drew their attention. A tall mirror stood on an ornate bronze stand, its surface covered by a heavy velvet cloth. The fabric seemed to absorb their flashlight beams, the deep red color almost black in the darkness. "The Tempest mirror," Michael breathed, remembering Blackwood's journal. He approached it slowly, aware of Sarah moving to cover the room's corners with her weapon. "Mike," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "Look at the floor." Their flashlight beams revealed concentric circles carved into the stone floor around the mirror, filled with more of those time-related symbols. But what made Michael's heart skip was what lay scattered within those circles: watches, phones, and personal effects. He recognized Professor Riggs' wallet among them. Next to it lay an antique pocket watch that could have belonged to Theodore Blackwood himself. Each item was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if they'd been there for both days and decades simultaneously. "We need to see what's under that cloth," Michael said, stepping carefully over the circles. "Wait," Sarah called. "We should document this first." She reached for her phone, then cursed. "My phone's dead. Shows 3:17 and won't respond." "Same here." Michael was already reaching for the velvet cloth. "But we need to know." "Detective Hale, stop." A new voice rang out from the stairs. They spun around to see Laura King descending, her face pale but determined. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Laura." "How did you?" Michael began, but she cut him off. "There's no time. It's almost 3:17, and they're already here." She pointed behind them, toward the mirror. Michael turned slowly, his flashlight beam catching the edge of the velvet cloth. It was moving. Not as if blown by a draft, but as if something behind it was pushing outward. The fabric rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. "Laura, what do you know about this?" Sarah demanded, her weapon trained on the mirror. "Everything Professor Riggs discovered, he shared with me," Laura said, descending the last few steps. "The Tempest mirror isn't just a window to other times, it's a door. And there are things on the other side, things that have been watching us through every reflection, waiting for the right moment to cross over." "What things?" Michael asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "The custodians of time," Professor Riggs called them. "They guard the boundaries between moments, between then and now. When someone gets too close to understanding their nature," she gestured to the personal effects scattered on the floor, "they take them." "Why 3:17? Sarah's voice was steady, professional, even as the temperature in the room seemed to drop further. "It's not just a time," Laura explained. "It's a coordinate in the fabric of reality. The moment when the barrier between times is thinnest. Professor Riggs believed the original builders of this house knew this. They built it on a temporal nexus point, incorporating symbols of chronological power into its very structure. But they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The velvet cloth was now undulating rhythmically, like slow breathing. Sarah's flashlight flickered, then died. Michael's followed a moment later, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. "They're coming," Laura whispered. "They always come when someone gets close to the truth." Michael's phone lit up in his pocket, casting a pale glow. 3:16. "We need to leave," Sarah said, already backing toward the stairs. "Now." "It's too late," Laura replied. They'd been waiting for this moment since Professor Riggs first discovered their existence. The only choice now is to face them. Michael felt a strange calm settle over him. "Then let's see what we're dealing with." Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the velvet cloth and pulled. The mirror's surface wasn't reflective, it was like looking into a deep pool of mercury, swirling and shifting. As they watched, shapes began to form in its depths. Figures that seemed to be made of living shadow, their forms constantly shifting between human and something else entirely. They had no faces, only swirling patterns that resembled clock faces, numbers flowing across their surfaces like liquid. "Detective Hale," a voice spoke, though none of the figures seemed to have mouths. It was like hearing time itself speak, a sound that existed in the past, present, and future simultaneously. "We have been expecting you." "Where is Professor Riggs?" Michael demanded. "Where are all of them?" "They are where they need to be," the voice replied. "As you will be." The figures began to step out of the mirror, their movements jerky and unnatural, like watching time-lapse photography in reverse. Where their feet touched the ground, the stone seemed to age decades in seconds. Sarah fired her weapon, but the bullets passed through the shadows as if they were smoke. The figures didn't even pause. "You can't fight them with physical weapons," Laura shouted. "They exist outside of conventional time." Michael felt a cold sensation on his shoulder, like being touched by the memory of ice. He spun around to find one of the figures reaching for him, its clockwork face inches from his own. In its swirling patterns, he saw flashes of other times, other places: Professor Riggs in his study, Theodore Blackwood writing in his journal, countless others who had discovered too much about the nature of time. "If you take us," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "more will come looking." "They always do," the figure replied. "Time is a circle, Detective Hale. This moment has happened before, and it will happen again." Michael's phone display changed to 3:17. The world seemed to pause, like a skipped heartbeat in the rhythm of reality. He saw Sarah reaching for him, Laura backing away toward the stairs, the shadow figures advancing, all frozen in a single endless moment. Then time began to flow again, but differently. Michael felt it moving around him like a river flowing upstream, carrying him toward the mirror's mercurial surface. He tried to resist, but how does one fight time itself? The last thing he heard was Sarah shouting his name, her voice stretching and distorting like a recording played at the wrong speed. Then the mirror's surface enveloped him, and he understood everything. He saw time as it truly was, not a linear progression but a vast, intricate web, each moment connected to countless others. He saw the custodians moving through this web, maintaining its structure, preventing paradoxes, preserving the delicate balance of cause and effect. And he saw why they took people like him, like Riggs, like Blackwood. Those who came too close to understanding the true nature of time became part of its machinery. In that moment of clarity, Michael Hale ceased to exist as he had before. He became something else, something that existed across all moments simultaneously. He was still in the basement of 419, Blackwood Drive, but he was also everywhere else, everyone else. The next morning, Detective Sarah Martinez would file a report about the disappearance of her partner. She would describe entering the basement of the Blackwood house, finding evidence of previous disappearances, and then, nothing. Her memory of the events after 3:17 a.m. would be frustratingly blank. The basement door would be gone when backup arrived, the wall smooth as if it had never existed. Teams of investigators would search the house repeatedly but find no trace of the hidden room or the mysterious mirror. They would discover the connection between the disappearances, the 50-year pattern, but they would have no way to explain it. Laura King would vanish too, her apartment found empty, her research on temporal artifacts missing. The only trace would be a note left on her desk: time isn't what we think it is. They aren't our enemies, they're our future. The house at 419 Blackwood Drive still stands today. Sometimes, new owners report strange occurrences: clocks that stop at 3:17, glimpses of shadowy figures in mirrors, the feeling of being watched by something that exists just outside the normal flow of time. Some have even reported seeing a man in modern clothes walking through the house, his face covered in shifting patterns like clock faces, appearing and disappearing between one moment and the next. Local legends say that if you enter the house at exactly 3:17 a.m. and look into a mirror, you might see them, the custodians of time, and among them, familiar faces. A history professor passionate about ancient artifacts. A Victorian-era merchant obsessed with time. A detective who asked too many questions. But no one who has tried to prove these stories has ever returned to share what they found. Perhaps that's for the best. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be remembered, passed down through generations as warnings about the dangers of looking too deeply into the machinery of reality. As for Michael Hale, he exists now in every tick of every clock, in every reflected surface, in every moment between moments. He watches as others discover the truth about time, as they follow the same path he once did. Sometimes, in the split second before he helps them cross over, he wants to warn them. But he understands now that every discovery, every disappearance, every repetition of this eternal cycle serves a greater purpose. Time must be protected. The boundaries must be maintained. The mirror must continue its work. And at 3:17, in a house where all the clocks have stopped, another seeker will find their way to the truth. The cycle will continue, as it always has, as it always must. For time is not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean, vast, deep, and full of currents that move in patterns we're not meant to understand. And in that ocean, the custodians of time swim eternal, watching, waiting, preserving the delicate balance between what was, what is, and what must be. The next time you check your clock and see 3:17, remember this story. And if you catch a glimpse of something moving in your mirror, something that looks almost human but not quite, don't look too closely. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. After all, time has its own plans for each of us. And somewhere, in a moment between moments, Detective Michael Hale is watching, making sure those plans unfold exactly as they should.